Hi, everyone, and welcome. I am joined here today by Alexander Mercouris. And from India, we have the ambassador Bhadrakumar, who is, I would call, a giant in India's diplomacy. He's got 30 years of diplomatic career. He's been an ambassador and held other positions across the world. So it's a great privilege to have the both of you here today. Discussing how the world is changing and also India's role in this, as we see now, especially with this restructuring of relations between United States and Russia. I guess both the Americans and the Russians now are recognizing that the world is becoming more multipolar, and in a multipolar world, India will, unavoidably be one center of power. We see, Modi get along with Trump, Modi gets along with Putin. So if Russia and the United States can change their relationship, how will this change the world? And what will be India's position in this? Maybe if we start with you, Ambassador Bhadrakumar, how do you see the role of India in this new multipolar setting?
Thank you, Professor, for giving me this privilege. This is a very prestigious platform, and I feel somewhat intimidated, that in the presence of you both, because you are such giants. Every day you are coming out with very solid ideas, which are highly stimulating for the intellectuals all over the world. Let me try to contribute as best as I can. Coming straight to the point that you made, I would respond this way: that when it comes to India, India's role in the emerging world order, the international system, and its capacity to influence world politics, all that taken into account, I must say that it is not in a unilinear line. You need to take a immediate, short-term perspective, which I will begin with that. And then there is a medium and long-term perspective where I would suggest, modestly, that much of what you said is holding good, because let me first separate that first, in the sense that by virtue of its size, the landmass, its geographical location in Asia, the population, and the dynamism that is apparent in the recent decades in its growth and development, with all the aberrations, a certain degree of political stability in terms of the foundations of democratic rule. There is a lot of criticism about it going on all over the world about what India is turning out to be in the most recent years. But I must qualify that still there is a legitimate claim India can have in the community of democracies. So now these are all very important factors. There are many more, but these are very important factors when you take the global south. So therefore, if you take, and if you agree with me that in the multiple world, the global south is going to be a certain interact with the would do, but India has its own style, its own idiom in communicating. It has its limitations in terms of the resources at its disposal to win friends and influence people. But nonetheless, there is a certain degree of appeal. Now, this is going back to the national liberation movements and freedom struggle and all that. And therefore, when India says something, there is a certain receptivity to what it is saying. in the global south. Now, that alone is a very big factor. You know very well that much of the global south, very disdainfully kept distance from the Western world when they wanted these countries to impose sanctions on Russia following the conflict, when the conflict erupted in Ukraine. But so you see, global south has economic clout is limited, but in sheer numbers and in terms of its presence on the world stage and its definitely its capacity to influence the course of events as it develops in the medium term, long term in the world order, these things matter. So, medium and long term, Professor, let me tell you that I completely go along with you. But the important thing is today, about what India is doing and how it is impacting the present situation, which is very dangerous situation, which is a dangerous situation, extremely fluid, not only fluid, but extremely dangerous also. I don't think that, the processes that have begun, I must slightly digress here, the processes that have begun in reopening the communication channels, the clogged communication channels between the two superpowers, the United States and Russia, I don't think that it is going very smoothly. Both sides are interested, genuinely interested, and both sides also think, each side also thinks that the other side is interested in reopening these communication links. But look at the visits of Macron and Stammer. It shows that this is not the whole story. There are certain ambiguities in the situation which we can discuss in detail separately, particularly with regard to the peace talks as and when they begin. I don't think that they have begun seriously. And what can happen? Then when we look into that, many of these things will fall in place. Today, India's preoccupation is in terms of the fact that it is in a position of disadvantage. It has excellent relations with Russia, a time-tested relationship, and it has equally trustful relationship with the United States in many ways is there, in the sense that technology transfer has begun to take place, something which India wants to source from the United States. Investments are possible, defense relationship, all these things are working to India's advantage. So it is a relationship which is steadily on an upward curve. And it is going, and there are no major hiccups, there. The little bit irritants come, like, one or two things I can probably flag if it really matters or not. Like what happened in the last period of the Biden presidency. But that apart, it's like the compass is set. And not only in the US, the relationship with India is very unique here even in the United States, because and consensus. So the transition for India from one presidency to another, the transition is always very uncertain as far as the rest of the world is concerned, because whatever is settled in the previous, the compass of the previous presidency never is quite applicable when a new president comes into power. But in India, when you take India's case, there is a bipartisan consensus, which is a core factor that Democrats, Republicans, despite the political polarization in the US, there is a certain unanimity there, that this is a very important relationship. It must be fostered, and India must receive serious attention and so on, which again is all very well from the Indian point of view. So you see, it's a relationship which India is not willing to look through the prism of the big struggle, the gigantic struggle, the momentous struggle, the epochal struggle that is playing out on the global scene in terms of the neocon globalists and that part of agenda. If you just look through the Indian rhetoric, you would find that these things don't figure at all there. And India has come up with a doctrine of multi-alignment. Multi-alignment, if you're a little bit cynical, you can say that it is being opportunistic. That is, it will have the best of everything, but at the same time, it will do cherry picking. That is what it is about. And don't confuse it with strategic autonomy. This is what India is practicing now. Point. And in today's world, internet era and all that, everything is out there in the open for people to understand. And people do understand that India is probably one of the few countries which is gained from the Ukraine conflict. Let me be very frank about it, And but at the same time, look at what has happened. The oil trade, if you take, the defense trade, if you take, you see, Russia is a country, is the only country with a military-industrial complex which has been instructed by the political leadership to transfer the cutting-edge technologies to India. There's no problem for Russians to do that. They do that willingly. The latest one is this fifth-generation stealth fighter, this Su-56, Su-57, whatever, Su, Sukhoi jet, There was an exhibition in Bangalore, in the southern city of India. And it's a major exhibition where even F-35 was displayed there. And there, apparently an offer has come from Russia for co-production of this aircraft in India, with India. So this is the extent to which, and it's the most advanced aircraft in the Russian defense forces. And so you see this sort of a willingness to transfer technology. All that is there when it comes to Russia. So it's not a relationship that India can sort of, what can I say, can marginalize for the sake of building the relationship with United States. But on the other hand, that relationship with China is very troubled. And if it is improving, in fact, one major reason for it is that, that despite the tensions at the official government-to-government level, the Indian business and industry, they are very keen on having a relationship with China. And that is because a number of inputs for the Indian industry, for production, manufacturing industry, they have to come from China. We have quite a pharma industry here, pharmaceutical industry, but many of the chemicals and formulations, much of it actually are sourced from China. A typical example, machine tools, all these things are there. So the business is very much interested, and business keeps saying that whatever might be the political differences and tensions, the relationship must be improved. But that has its limitations. So in the whole entire paradigm when you take, India is compared to, let me say Saudi Arabia, that comes readily to my mind because I'm familiar with that country and that part of the world. But if you compare it with Saudi Arabia, India is at a disadvantage because these three powers there. But look at the Saudis, the traditional allies of the United States, and a very strong relationship with Russia, including at the top level with Putin, and at the same time, a booming relationship with China, where much technology transfer is taking place, military cooperation, and even China even played a role in the rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. So, there are other countries, which are doing much better than India. Let me say that, India's... so the question is this, is this all India could have done? I had been consistently writing that the time is running out for India to seriously improve relations with China. But, we dug a dug a hole in the ground and said that, that unless this disengagement and those border issues, in the last 3-4 years which cropped up, unless they are resolved, no relationship. No, I never agreed with that, in the sense that, that I had spent something like 13, 14 years simply on Pakistan relationship. I can tell you, much of my career in the service looks to me now today as a wasteland, because there's nothing creative about it, improving the relationship with Pakistan. They're mostly what? Crisis management, tensions, round the clock tensions, this is it is. And then a slight mistake is definitely has the potential to flare up into a major conflict at the border. So you're all the time, on the razor's edge. But, what I'm saying is that this relationship with China would have been handled differently. Because when you have problems of this nature with a country, you should have intensified your interaction with that country. You should have sought out all avenues available to you to interact with that country, to put your point of view across, and to work on the relationship. When you want to work on the relationship, you must have some content in the relationship. But if you pull down the shutters and sit there tightly, and I never believe that China is a country which will succumb to pressure, psychological pressure of this kind, because, then one of my senior foreign secretaries when I took over as the head of the Pakistan division, once told me that in the beginning, when I came back from my posting in Pakistan and was taking over the division in the ministry, he told me that I asked him for advice. So he said, that anything that you take on, of course, I knew Pakistan very well by that time, but he said that anything that you address, firstly, close your eyes, just think what must be motivating the other side. It is not as if the other side has no compulsions. There are always compulsions. And you cannot handle any situation unless you can have a fair idea of what are the intentions on the other side. So, you see, the thing is, all this requires communication. So in Pakistan, for instance, the relationship was most of the time, in the doldrums, like that. But communication channels, we always kept up. But this government has a problem there. It is stopped communicating with Pakistan. And when it came to the border issues with China, it stopped communicating with China. And this particular period, if you do not have communications, who's going to be the loser? The country which refuses to interact. Because this is the time where, that you must interact with all and sundry. And this is the time where, that you should cast your net wide, because we are moving into multipolarity. But nothing of the sort happened. So these things are today telling on the Indian position, India's capacity to influence, to mold the world order. And so therefore, what India has to now wait is that, Putin said, Monday, Putin said in that interview with the editor in Moscow, he said at the end, it's an absolutely brilliant interview. Alexander, you analyzed it. That way. But this particular point you missed, He said at the end, that, the big crisis that is coming up on the Ukraine side, if you let me, there's some ellipsis necessary here, is about, this troop deployment in Ukraine. And when that was, Putin didn't touch on it. And obviously, it was an interview which was very carefully prepared, because there's a Western audience and probably Trump himself. So it was a very unusual interview, And I could see that, that Putin makes statements, looking across over the horizon on the other side of the world. Now, therefore, this editor asked him about this troop deployment things and so on. Then Putin slipped it in that morning he had a conversation with Xi Jinping. And he said that they discussed this issue. Xi Jinping, and he was not asked about it, about China at all, but he brought it in. He took the opportunity. And then he said, that President Xi Jinping informed him that this Friends of Peace grouping within BRICS is going to have very soon another meeting in New York. But, this is the let me qualify here. This is the China, Brazil, South Africa. That axis. India stayed away because, you see, this is why I'm saying I mentioned this point, because this clearly shows India's problem today. So Putin said, that Xi Jinping informed him that this meeting is there today, and he left it hanging in the air. It's a very, very clear messaging to the other side, and this was just before Starmer's coming there, and the Russians and Brits, have a very long history of hostility, 17th century. So, they know each other well. And so the Russians probably must have taken this visit with the utmost importance, because if there is anyone who can pull aside Trump from the present track of communicating with the Russians and so on, it is only Britain can do it. And I was noticing the body language of the press conference and so on this morning, and I think Starmer did a marvelous job, and he must be going back feeling rather happy about what they have achieved. So you see, the Putin's intention was to probably, in the way I looked at it, was probably to signal that it is not only the Western world, which can deploy troops there, because if it comes to that, then China also can, and BRICS can. So he brought in BRICS, but then he brought in this group, and the problem now, even there, is going to be this: in the scheme of things, India should have been there, but India is not there. India is not there because Modi himself, during his visit to the United States, he took a position, this supposedly neutral position. His remarks were oriented in a certain direction to mark a distance from the Russian interests and Russian position. I thought it was going too far, in my opinion. There was no requirement. We don't need to justify our policies towards another country, towards Trump. We don't have to justify it to him. It's quite clear that we are looking after our interests. And what is the point in, therefore, mentioning that this is not an era of wars? When I went to Moscow, I also went to Kiev. Who asked about all this? There's no requirement for it. He is marking a distance from Russia. And now the point is, Russians gave a very long rope to India in these last 2 years, and would have liked, in fact, India to have expressed itself, from what I can see, in a forthright way about this. But none of the Indian commentaries at the official level ever spoke about the Ukraine conflict, except as a conflict. Now, we are all erudite enough to understand that this conflict is only the symptom of a much bigger malaise. And there are root causes behind it. And then you're free to trace it back to the collapse of the Soviet Union and the unfinished business of the collapse of the Soviet Union from the Western point of view. Or you can come down to 2014 and look at the coup and say it all started from there. Or you can go to 1994 and say Bill Clinton began this drama about NATO enlargement. So whatever it be, there is a history behind it. So when you say this is not an era of wars, Russia launched a war. It's a fact. Now, why did it happen? The Indian position just does not get into that at all. Because the point is, even Trump, when we look at it, with all the good things that he has done in jettisoning the narrative, he is far from admitting that the United States is primarily responsible for this conflict. Who asked Bill Clinton and stroked Albert to open this can of worms on NATO expansion? There was no pressure at all from any quarter at that time. In fact, Russia was willingly playing, Boris Yeltsin's Russia, a very cooperative role. So, the Americans themselves ought to be blamed for this. And when Trump says, this is where I say that Trump also is, rather, to some extent, that this began because of NATO and it was mishandled, but that is in a polemical way in relation to the happenings during the Biden presidency. But this is a old problem. I was in Moscow in the embassy when the collapse took place, the final period of Gorbachev, and all kinds of things took place at that time. Let's not forget that Margaret Thatcher came to Moscow to plead with Gorbachev to go slow in disbanding Warsaw Pact, that Britain is not ready for it. And the same thing, was the French position at that time on the unification of Germany. German question was the residues of it still were there in the 80s in the Western mind. So, this is the kind of scenario in which we need to look at the Ukraine conflict. Otherwise, we are not being fair to ourselves when we opinionate on this conflict. But India never once did that. India has not bought into this question at all of NATO expansion. China, which has taken a neutral position, has not shied away from it at all. Chinese commentaries openly speak about it. And Chinese commentaries today, Chinese pronouncements openly say that the root causes of the conflict must be addressed. Mm-hmm. What is this? It's euphemistically putting that that NATO's role, etc., need to be addressed. Without that, there cannot be a settlement. So, coming back to the point where we began, in the immediate and short term, India has to wait and twiddle its fingers to see what emerges out of this. And when it emerges out of this, I give it to my erstwhile colleagues in the foreign policy establishment who are very, very high level of professionalism exists in that wing of the Indian government even today. Mm-hmm. I'm very sure that they will look for optimally taking advantage of the situation, and they will interpolate the Indian interests on this emerging situation, and will derive conclusions out of it, will work on it, and will inform the political leadership that this is how we should go about it, this is where our interests lie. So it's not going to be the end of the world. But in the immediate and short term, I think India has painted itself into a corner. Mm. And I have tried to explain, maybe I'm sounding a little harsh, but I am also quite aware of the fact that India has its limitations in the present situation. So therefore, let's not exaggerate the role that India can play today, or that the role that India is playing today. Certain things should be avoided. That is all I'm trying to say.
Well, thank you very, very much for that. Before I respond, I just wanted to make one quick observation, which is that I would like to mention your blog, Indian Punchline. I read it whenever you post an article. It's one of the very few places that I go to always whenever something new appears, and it's one of the places where I get my ideas and they shape them, and I find it most interesting. I think anybody who is interested in international affairs should go and read your blog whenever anything appears. Just to say that, I would just like to add that as well. Now, thank you for that really absolutely fascinating explanation of the strengths and weaknesses of the Indian position. Now, this is before my time. I wasn't there when it happened, but I've heard many, many people talk about this. I remember hearing about this in my childhood from diplomats, from Greek diplomats, from all kinds of people, about how in the 1950s, relations between India and China were very good. There was a strong relationship, or at least appeared to be, between Zhou Enlai and Pandit Nehru. And this greatly shaped the international situation at that time. It played a critical role in enabling the non-aligned movement, as it then was, to establish itself and to become a force in world affairs. And importantly, it made India more relevant in Washington. the Americans had to take it much more seriously, precisely because it had this perspective at that time of the relationship with China and indeed with the Soviet Union being very good. And India seemed to be, at that time, something of a significant player. Well, then there was the conflict in the 1960s, which we don't need to talk about, but which clearly still casts a very, very long shadow. Relations with China ever since have become, to put it mildly, very complicated. They've had their ups and they've had their downs, but they've never really sorted themselves out. We've never gone back to that situation that existed briefly in the 1950s. And is it perhaps the case? And, I ask this question because it seems to me also to relate a lot to Indian domestic politics and to the Indian media, which I find difficult to follow, actually. I mean, the print media, the television media is now becoming different, and you have television stations like WION who are now publishing, and they're different. But there's always seemed to me to be a very strong sort of regionalism and about Indian policy that is very, very focused on its own immediate neighborhood. The conflict with Pakistan is given overriding importance. I wonder whether that has also had an effect on shaping Indian domestic politics. I ask these questions because these are open questions. I don't know the answers to this. Whether, to some extent, Hindutva and all of this, which has had a long history in India, but whether it's partly risen to prominence because of the fact that there is this perennial conflict with Pakistan. The relationship with China has got mixed up into all of this in some way. And one of the factors that has been holding India back as a result is a narrow focus on local affairs, regional affairs, and above all, a lack of self-confidence. And it's that lack of self-confidence which distinguishes India so much from China. I've had dealings with people in China, and they have this overwhelming self-confidence, this absolute sense that they can do anything. They can do anything domestically. They're able to build railways and do whatever it is because they feel they can. India could do the same, could be doing very similar things, but it doesn't have that sense of exuberant self-confidence that China does. And what is the cause of this? Is it possibly the conflict with Pakistan? Is it a legacy of partition? I ask these are very open questions. It's just that I'm trying to understand why India does punch below its weight in the way that it does at the present time. And what is why is it doing so more today than perhaps it did briefly in the 1950s?
Alexander, if you live in India, certain things will occur to you, which will show you that the realities are to be seen in an entirely different way. I don't think the neighborhood policies, any country takes particular interest in neighborhood, but I don't think that is really the factor here. Most countries, most serious countries, adjusted themselves to the post-Soviet reality in world politics. But from the Indian perspective, when you look at it, the 1990s was a lost decade in that sense. That decade was completely lost because Indian economy was in a shambles. This old socialist style of growth that was switching over to market economy because that failed to deliver 2%, 3% growth rate and was not coping with the needs of the country or the economy. So there's this transition taking place, and foreign exchange reserves were absolutely non-existent. We have to pawn our gold reserves in Britain, and recently only we took out the gold. It's like in a number of countries, India is also heard that the gold is there or not. We really don't even know. So we took away much of it. We brought back, because all kinds of stories are in circulation. But seriously, the collapse of the Soviet Union unnerved India. And I think it was not justified. It was unnerved India because the relationship with the United States was in a very bad shape at that point. And there was even some kind of a rancor towards India, that it sided with the Soviet Union on XYZ issues. So, the entire focus was on building a relationship with the United States. And the Americans well enough that if you allow them to come into the tent, then they take over the tent. So you see, towards the second half of the 1990s, you would find that the strategic discourses in the country were all geared to this end: how to build the relationship with the United States, etc., etc. And then alongside on a parallel track, there was also the retreat of, the dull roar of the Soviet presence. You could hear the retreat. Boris Yeltsin's early teams, foreign policy team, they had no knowledge of India, no experience with India, and no interest with India. The first foreign minister, I won't mention the name, foreign minister, never even cared to pay a visit to India. You see, they were all Western-oriented, the Yeltsin's team at that time. Things began changing by mid-1990s. But by then, the Americans had moved in a big way. And to be fair to the Russians, they didn't have the kind of resources at that time to project themselves in capitals like India, which was not the top priority at that time. Even for Russia, the top priority was the United States. So the American presence, so much so that one of our strategic writers, who's still around, he wrote a book. And that book, its title was Crossing the Rubicon. That was the title of that book. That is clearly, metaphorically, that is what took place. We crossed the Rubicon at that time. And then then now you find, for instance, I don't even get invited now to the seminar circuit because this is all a closed door thing today. And many of the think tanks are funded by the Americans. Most of the think tanks are funded by the Americans. And their interaction is primarily with the Americans, not with the neighboring countries. Sitting in Delhi, I can tell you this, that neighboring countries do not fit up to that extent here. If you look at our newspapers, any little bit happening in the United States is big news. Any small visitor from the United States, the Prime Minister's door gets opened. But other countries, if you look at it, even with this Ukraine and so on, now you look at it last week, for example, the kind of attention that Russia paid to Tajikistan. Putin himself, was so active on that. And I was reading in the press that day before yesterday, an African leader was there. So you see, there is a big picture, and you are working on that big picture, and nothing gets neglected in that. And that is really the behavioral pattern of a serious country. But in case of India, it is not happening. So therefore, if you go for seminars or conferences or everywhere, it's all one type of narrative. Mind you, let me tell you that first 2 years, almost into the third year, the feeling here was Russia was going to lose in Ukraine. Lock, stock, and barrel, the narrative was, we lapped up the narratives, our media, you mentioned one media organization. There is a very telling example, that one itself, that the way they lapped up this one, this version of events there. So everything was actually absorbed from the Western media. And I was a lone voice, in fact, at that time in 2022. to say that this is not a war that Russia can afford to lose. Because you and I know that this war is not between Russia and Ukraine. And that that this is an existential struggle for Russia. And Russia has gone through this in modern history, all along. And therefore, and knowing the kind of reserves, the intellectual resources and the reserves that it has got, the Russian nation, I knew that, that there's no question of Russia being defeated in this struggle. It'll mobilize its resources, its mother Russia, that kind of thing. But the picture here was entirely different. The press was hostile towards Russia. All kinds of, every morning it was such an irritating thing to see this silly kind of reporting taking place in the Indian media about the war in Ukraine. But since America was involved in the war, it again became a big news in India also immediately. Because whatever American interests are there, Americans there, I'm sure, to some extent they get good briefings from that side also. So the media was pro-American, the think tanks were pro-American, and the leadership was also pro-American, in India, in the post-Soviet period, if you take it. Even the Indo-Soviet relationship, this problem existed. That what made the difference was that the political leadership led, in fact, led from the front. This conviction that the relationship with the Soviet Union is extremely important for India. I don't think at the political level that sort of a commitment existed. Perhaps at the level of Mr. Modi, we had a personal equation, but then it's of a different kind. It is in terms of personal diplomacy. But I don't believe in it. To some extent, it can give an atmospherics to the relationship. The optics look quite exciting, but for enduring relationships, the harmony needs to be worked out, in terms of the congruence of interests and so on. That never took place, in the post-Soviet period with regard to Russia. So much so that 10 years back, the common refrain in India was this, that Russia is finished. It has no future. Why 10 years? Even 5 years back. Even at the time, when there was no awareness of what took place in 2014 in Ukraine, in the Indian intellectual circles. What really? We all were reading, even in the Western press, about Victoria Nuland going and distributing biscuits or cookies to the Maidan to the protesters. These strange fellows, opening fire at the crowd, provoking violence, and all those things, they're all blacked out from the Indian consciousness. So, what took place is a very sad thing to happen. When you recollect the 1950s and 60s, India had actually a much greater awareness of the world situation than today. You are absolutely right in saying that India shrunk and has become simply everything is put in terms of our interests. And even when it champions and claims that, that it has a mantle of leadership in the global South, what does it do for the global South? Russians take positions, Chinese take positions, but India refuses to take positions because it's not in quote-unquote India's interest to voice opinions on issues which do not concern us. This is the kind of thing. Is it the sign of a world power? And India has still not defined, except in terms of its population size and economy and so on. What is its real claim to be a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council? What does it plan to uphold? And what are its principles? So, when you do not have the courage of convictions, you withdraw into yourself and, you keep dabbling with this kind of things, the personal diplomacy at the leadership level and the optics of it being transferred for political gains in the domestic politics in India, that we are a world leader, India's prestige is soaring high. And recently one serious intellectual here, very thoughtful intellectual, wrote a piece in Bhanu Pratap Mehta. I don't know if you've heard of him. It's a very, very serious intellectual, very thoughtful intellectual. He wrote a piece in the Indian Express newspaper that we are living in a fantasy land, imagining that, we are a world power, that we carry a lot of weight in the world around us. And, some of the things you mentioned yourself, India is a stirring voice in the, it's not, he said it's not really so. Nobody gives a damn. And for that to happen, India has to pull itself up and be something else entirely, something else. So that is not happening. So, in our discussion, we must have a sense of proportions. When you place India, situate India in the present day world situation, it's dismal. And a paradox here is that you might imagine that the industry lobby in India, the corporate lobby, must be so damn powerful that it must be, taking India in this direction towards the West. Not really like that. They are the ones, who are probably the strongest advocates of strategic autonomy, because the industry has come to a certain stage of development that, it doesn't want, in fact, this sort of favoritism. Now, papers are full of news that Elon Musk is going to be given a fast track. So what about the guys who are already making electric cars in India? And people are buying these electric cars. And today's newspaper said that more and more people are buying it, and by 2030 or something like that, 30% of the cars would be, in another 5 years' time, 30% of all cars would be electric cars. So none of them is foreign made. They are all made in India. So the industry is not really enamored of this, that that you should open the doors for the Americans to come in. This is all, in my opinion, therefore, very succinctly put, this is all our own creation. This sort of a parochial, you put it regional, but I would even go down to say sort of a parochial mindset, and we have a tunnel vision as a result of that.
You bring up a lot of interesting topics. The awareness of India, the world around it. I guess the lack of taking position on key issues such as NATO expansion, given the huge consequences it had, and of course not falling behind in the rise of great powers in this multipolar system, and of course the need to improve relations with China. I think this is really at the front and center of what India should be focusing on. But it would also be interesting, of course, to see to what extent India, one of its benefits, of course, is that given that it gets along with everyone, that it could actually not provide security guarantees, but have a role in observing the peace. Hopefully, if a peace is negotiated in Ukraine. But we're almost out of time, so I wanted to ask Alexander also, and you, Bhadrakumar, if you have any final thoughts, how India could possibly move forward on this.
Well, I will be very, very, very brief, because I have to say I found this an exceptionally interesting program, and can I just say thank you for that? I've learned a huge amount today, and I'm going to circulate it to a number of people I know, because I think it's essential that people listen to the points that you've been making, Ambassador. But can I just ask, is perhaps the key to unlocking India's potential as a great power? And can I say this? My own huge sense is that most countries in the world would welcome a bigger role by India. They would want to see India playing a much more active role in the world. India actually potentially has many friends, but is the key to this improving relations with China? That this is ultimately the single thing that perhaps can help to resolve this issue of parochialism that you mentioned, this single-minded focus on the United States? And what do you think perhaps are the prospects, the chances of that?
I agree with you 100%. And I've been plugging this line throughout that for India's foreign policy strategy to be anywhere near optimal for China. Because, I'm not a pro-China man or any such thing. I'm not advocating anything from an ideological point of view either. The point is, even if you take interests, national interests as the litmus test, I believe that Indian economy's growth trajectory taken into account, the market conditions taken into account, the economic realities in terms of the imperatives for job creation is taken into account. All these across the board, China is an irreplaceable partner for India. And these 3.5 years, we cannot overlook the fact that they were lost years, and when so much is happening in the world. The fact is, in the Chinese commentaries, it often comes, but in the Indian commentaries, I'm really yet to see. Sporadically, once in a way, it figures. The point is, Chinese keep saying that if the two countries can stand together, even while they have differences or disputes, stand together on areas where they have shared common interests, it has a multiplier effect internationally. I am completely in agreement with that. That we see occasionally a sign of it when you come to areas like, trade and so on. You come to that. But even in trade, when you look at it, everything is taken as Chinese position is taken with an element of suspicion. And of course, the Western powers encourage India to move in that kind of direction. Now, today and yesterday, the Ursula von der Leyen was in Delhi on a visit with all the commissioners of the European Union. I was reading a commentary this morning by the European counterpart of CFR, Council for Foreign Relations in New York. There is a Brussels-based think tank on the EU side. And the argument that they have peddled a commentary on this visit, that European Union and India are sailing in the same boat because the United States is undependable. Can you imagine? Now, the point is, I am sure this is the kind of thing that is being told to the Indians. And this, so the erudition is lacking. First of all, the erudition is not there, and unless we have an erudition, I really don't have an answer to this. How we can bring about this sort of a proximity between India and China, and if they can work together, both will have advantages. And if they don't work together, Chinese commentators have even said that even China is a loser if it is not able to carry India along. This is the extent to which the Chinese side have said. So I think Russians have built up, and there is a model available for India. In fact, I was in the Soviet Union, 2 terms I had, and at that time, a Chinese negotiator who was discussing the border situation, border issues, a Russia hand, a Soviet hand in the Chinese foreign policy team, came as ambassador to Tashkent. And when I was there as ambassador, and we exchanged notes, and we became great friends while in Tashkent. And he was telling me, that what a torturous thing it was, and how, then suddenly, it's like one fine day, the tune changed, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, or with Gorbachev coming, the tune changed. So, China has its concerns in terms of, where India is going with the United States. Now, look, I'll stop at this point. Briefly, let me tell you, the Trump won, and India's first priority is to host is to arrange a meeting for Modi with Trump, and move on from there to get Trump to come to India, because India is hosting the Quad. I don't know whether Modi, whether that is one of Trump's priorities, to come to India for a Quad summit. Quad, the four country. So all these things. We are on the one track. We are building with China. We are on this other side. We are doing this kind of things. And Quad is, in my opinion, is a completely useless affair. It has no future. Neglecting BRICS. Now, Professor mentioned about this, that peacekeeping role in Ukraine coming up. But if it is coming up under the BRICS rubric, see, the three countries that are there, India is not one of them. Why couldn't India have been part of it? India, because we are afraid. Brazil also has a very strong relationship with the United States, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't have an independent stance on Ukraine. So there are very serious problems. It's very worrisome, serious problems. So all I can say is that that India is, and our latest mantra is this: that the India and Russia and Ukraine should sort out this issue. You see, what does it mean? It means that they don't know the ABC of the Ukraine conflict. See, this is where it is. This is the problem.
This is a challenge of being the leading state in the non-aligned movement as well. If not taking a position at all, it's gonna be more difficult for India to assert its position in the world. But anyways, I want to thank the both of you very much for your time, and I found this to be very interesting.
Yes, so did I. Very. Thank you,
Alexander.
Thank you very much.
I wish you both very well. You're really very placarious in the intellectual world in introducing thought processes of weak import in the kind of situation that is developing day to day. And I wish you all success in that, and would learn more from you in the coming days. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that, sir. And can I just again say, if people can read Indian Punchline, they will learn a huge amount. I do so whenever I read any one of your articles. Again, essential reading for anybody interested in international affairs.
Thank you.